The storm suits you, Abigail. Cold and soon to be forgotten. Those were the last words Richard Vance spat, his face a sneer against the blinding white fury, just before he spurred his horse and vanished into the blizzard. He'd ripped the warm buffalo coat from her shoulders seconds before, snatched her meager food, cast her trunk aside like garbage, left her, alone, freezing, in the heart of a plains winter storm that clawed at her thin dress with icy talons. He thought he was leaving a helpless woman to die, erasing a bad investment. But Richard Vance knew nothing of the iron buried deep within Abigail Hayes, iron forged in losses she never spoke of. And he couldn't conceive of the eyes already watching from the swirling chaos, eyes belonging not to the greedy world of settlers and contracts, but to the ancient spirit of the land itself. Salvation wouldn't come from Harmony Creek. It would rise from the snow, silent and unexpected as the hunter who carried it. The blizzard wasn't just a storm, it was a crucible. And the question wasn't if she'd survive, but who she would become when the fire met the ice. Only 3 days prior, the stagecoach had deposited Abigail Hayes onto the muddy main street of Harmony Creek. The air, thick with the smell of wet earth, pine shavings from the half-built structure down the way, and the ever-present tang of horse, felt heavy with scrutiny. Men lounging on the boardwalks outside the saloon and the mercantile paused their whittling or spitting to watch her descend, their gazes lingering on her plain gray traveling dress and the single, worn carpet bag she clutched. This wasn't the bustling hub of opportunity Richard Vance's letters had described. It was raw-boned, watchful, a scattering of buildings clinging precariously to the edge of an immense, indifferent wilderness. Hope, a fragile seedling carried across miles of rough travel, felt the chill wind already nipping at its leaves. She scanned the faces, her gaze instinctively cataloging details, a habit ingrained by years of navigating hardship back east after her family's quiet misfortunes. The way a storekeeper swept dust around a pile of refuse rather than clearing it, the slightly too loud laughter spilling from the saloon even in mid-afternoon, the tired slump of the blacksmith's shoulders. Small things, perhaps, but they painted a picture less glossy than Vance's careful script. She possessed a quiet alertness, a way of noticing the cracks in a smooth facade, learned through necessity. Then she spotted him. Richard Vance, standing on the porch of his mercantile, the painted sign bearing his name already looking a little weathered. He cut a figure distinct from the dusty inhabitants, taller, his dark coat impeccably brushed, his boots polished despite the mud threatening to engulf the street. He smiled as she approached, a wide, practiced smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, but didn't quite warm their pale blue depths. It was the smile of a man selling something. "Miss Hayes," he greeted, stepping forward, extending a hand gloved in fine leather. His grip was firm, perhaps a fraction too tight, holding her hand just a moment longer than necessary. "Abigail, a pleasure to finally meet you in person. Welcome to Harmony Creek. I trust the final leg of your journey wasn't too taxing?" "Mr. Vance," she replied, retrieving her hand, her voice steady though her heart hammered against her ribs. The journey was as expected. Long. She didn't elaborate. Complaining achieved nothing. Endurance was a currency she understood. She noted the swift, almost imperceptible sweep of his eyes over her attire, her luggage. An appraisal. "Excellent, excellent." He gestured expansively towards the store. "My little empire. Modest beginnings, of course, but growing. Harmony Creek is poised for greatness, Abigail, and we shall be at the heart of it." He spoke of we, but his eyes shone with singular ambition. Inside, the store was orderly but shadowed. Shelves held bolts of cloth, sacks of flour, tools, and tins, but a faint layer of dust dulled the newer items, and the air held a slight mustiness beneath the scent of coffee beans and cured tobacco. Abigail, whose father's failed general store was a sharp, painful memory, recognized the signs of inventory moving slower than pride allowed. Vance launched into a monologue about trade routes, land speculation, the coming railroad. He spoke with fervent confidence, but his fingers drummed restlessly on the scarred countertop near the ledger book. He asked about her journey, nodding absently at her replies, until he inquired, with a carefully casual air, "And your trunk? It arrived safely on the coach, I presume? Contained everything you intended to bring?" "Yes, Mr. Vance. It's with a stage agent." Inside that trunk lay not just her clothes and keepsakes, but the modest sum left from her parents' estate. Enough to secure passage, enough to offer a contribution to this new life, enough, apparently, to secure his interest. His relief at her confirmation was palpable, a slight release of tension in his shoulders. Splendid. He clapped his hands together. "Well, no sense lingering in town. My homestead, our future homestead awaits. It's a fair ride, half a day perhaps. We should start before the light fades. There's talk of weather moving in. Wouldn't want to get caught out." He glanced towards the already darkening sky, then back at her sturdy, travel-worn boots. "Hope you're accustomed to rough riding." That faint edge of condescension again. The assumption of fragility. "I manage," Abigail said evenly, meeting his gaze. "Endurance is something I learned early, Mr. Vance." A flicker of surprise, or perhaps annoyance, crossed his face before the pleasant mask settled back into place. But the undercurrent was there. He wasn't just welcoming a bride. He was assessing an asset. And deep within Abigail, beneath the hope she clung to, the old, familiar caution whispered a warning. The vast plain stretching beyond the town suddenly felt immense, isolating, and the man offering her partnership seemed more alien than the landscape itself. The air was growing colder, and not just from the approaching twilight. The ride out from Harmony Creek began under a sky bruised with shades of deepening gray and purple. Vance, mounted on a strong bay gelding whose quality spoke of careful investment, set a brisk pace, leading the way across the undulating prairie. Abigail followed on the smaller, somewhat lethargic mare he'd provided, her meager carpet bag balanced before her, while her precious trunk was securely, possessively, strapped behind Vance's saddle. He filled the initial silence with talk, relentless talk, of acreage, timber rights, water sources, plans for barns and fences on land that stretched, unfenced and seemingly untouched, for miles under the darkening sky. He spoke of his land, his vision, rarely soliciting her opinion, assuming her acquiescence. Abigail listened, her earlier unease solidifying into a quiet dread. His descriptions felt exaggerated, his confidence strained. There was a nervous energy about him, a restless scanning of the horizon that seemed less about appreciating the view and more about anticipating something. When her mare stumbled in a patch of loose shale, recovering quickly with a snort, Vance's reaction was disproportionate. "Careful," he snapped, wheeling his horse around, his voice tight with irritation, losing its practiced pleasantry. "That mare isn't mine to replace. We can't afford carelessness out here, Abigail." The accusation stung, not just for its unfairness, but for the underlying message. She was already proving inconvenient. He quickly smoothed his features back into a semblance of concern, but the flash of raw impatience had been revealing. The wind began to rise, a low moan through the sparse, dry grasses. It carried the first tentative snowflakes, large, wet flakes that melted on contact, but signaled a significant shift in the weather. Vance swore under his breath, pulling the collar of his fine wool coat tighter. Confound it. Didn't expect it this soon. Should have left town earlier. His agitation was palpable. Abigail felt the familiar tightening in her chest that preceded a real storm. The air tasted different, sharper. The light grew flat and gray. The wind carried the scent of deeper cold, of snow that would stick. Raised in hill country, where winter could clamp down without mercy, she recognized the signs instantly. She instinctively assessed their position, the surrounding terrain, the rapidly deteriorating conditions. She glanced at Vance's saddlebags, lean, clearly packed for a swift, uneventful trip. No extra blankets, minimal food visible. Her own small bag held only the dried apples and hardtack she'd secreted away. A lifelong habit of preparedness Vance would likely mock if he knew. "Mr. Vance," she began, raising her voice slightly against the rising wind. "The sky looks heavy. Perhaps finding shelter would be wise. There might be a draw or some rocks." He cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Nonsense. My cabin is just ahead. Over that ridge. Perhaps the next." We push on. But his knuckles were white where he gripped the reins, and his eyes darted nervously towards the swirling flakes, now falling faster, beginning to dust the landscape in white. He urged his horse forward, forcing Abigail's tired mare into a jarring trot she clearly disliked. The land grew rougher as they entered low, rolling foothills sparsely wooded with stunted pine and skeletal juniper. The snow was accumulating now, muffling sound, transforming the familiar shapes of the land into something alien. Abigail's observational skills, honed by years of quiet survival, kicked into high gear. She noted the way the wind scoured snow from one side of the ridges, piling it into deep drifts on the other. She saw potential overhangs, clusters of trees offering slightly better protection than others. She also saw tracks, not just deer or rabbit, but the distinct, deliberate prints of unshod ponies, partially filled with fresh snow, but still discernible to a careful eye. Travelers who knew this land, who moved through it regardless of weather. Comanche. A different kind of alertness sparked within her, not fear, but awareness. These were the people Vance spoke of with such contemptuous dread, yet their presence spoke of resilience, of knowledge she and Vance sorely lacked. Moments later, Vance saw the tracks too. His reaction was instantaneous and visceral. "Comanche," he hissed, his face blanching beneath his windburn. He fumbled for the pistol holstered at his hip, drawing it halfway, his eyes wide with terror as he scanned the trees. Damn savages. Never know where they'll appear. His fear felt exaggerated, primal, the reaction of someone deeply insecure beneath their bluster, terrified of anything outside their narrow control. Abigail remained silent, her gaze steady. She watched Vance, watched the falling snow, watched the tracks. His panic was more dangerous than any unseen warrior. He was losing control, not just of the situation, but of himself. The snow fell relentlessly now, a thick, swirling veil reducing visibility to yards. The wind howled, biting through her layers of clothing. Ahead lay only white uncertainty, led by a man whose fear was rapidly curdling into something ugly and unpredictable. The cold was deepening, outside and in. The early escalation was over, the full fury of the storm, and the man beside her was about to break. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of white. Snow drove horizontally, stinging like flung needles, erasing landmarks, trail, and sky. The wind shrieked, a physical force that threatened to tear Abigail from the saddle. Vance, lost and increasingly frantic, shouted curses that were ripped away by the gale. His pretense of control shattered completely, leaving only raw fear and selfish anger. He blamed the horses for their slow progress, the worsening light, and implicitly Abigail for simply being there, a burden he now clearly regretted. "Should be there by now," he yelled, his voice thin against the storm's roar. "This accursed weather. If you hadn't slowed us down." Abigail huddled lower over the mare's neck, shielding her face as best she could, her body aching with cold. The mare trembled beneath her, exhausted and stressed. Abigail scanned desperately through the swirling snow, searching for any sign of shelter. Vance, in his panic, was blind to. Her mind raced, calculating dwindling daylight, the depth of the cold, their utter lack of adequate supplies. The survival instincts honed by past deprivation surged. Conserve energy. Protect the core. Stay alert. She watched Vance. He burrowed deeper into his thick coat, her promised warmth, while her own shawl and dress offered pathetic resistance to the bone-chilling damp. He checked his saddlebags again, furtively, making sure she couldn't see what remained. He offered no word of comfort, no shared strategy, only muttered complaints and fearful glances into the white void. His self-preservation had become absolute, eclipsing any sense of duty or decency. It was then she noticed it, a subtle hesitation in the stride of Vance's bay gelding, a slight favoring of the left foreleg. "Mr. Vance," she called out, pointing. "Your horse. It seems lame." He pulled up sharply, peering through the snow, his face contorted with frustration. He dismounted, sinking nearly knee-deep in a drift, and briefly, angrily, checked the horse's leg. "Lame." He spat out the word like a curse, kicking savagely at the snowdrift. "Damnation. Ruined. Just perfect." Whether the injury was genuine or merely convenient, Abigail couldn't tell. But the look he shot her as he remounted held a chilling finality. The calculation in his eyes was stark now, stripped bare of pretense. "This changes things," he announced, his voice flat and hard above the wind. "We have to lighten the load. Drastically. Can't risk losing both horses." His meaning was terrifyingly clear even before he acted. With a sudden, brutal movement, he reached across, unlatching the straps, holding her trunk behind his saddle. It tumbled silently into a deep snowdrift, vanishing instantly. "My trunk! Richard!" she cried out, horrified, the name slipping out in her shock. All her worldly possessions, her connection to her past, gone. "Dead weight," he snarled, his face pitiless. Like certain passengers, he lunged then, grabbing for a small carpet bag. "No!" Abigail reacted instinctively, pulling it back, clutching it fiercely. "There's food in here." "Mine." His eyes narrowed, suspicion flaring. "Food? You brought your own. Why didn't you say?" The accusation hung in the air. She had held out on him. It seemed to justify, in his twisted mind, what he was about to do. He didn't pursue the bag. Instead, he guided the horses towards a nearby knot of pines, a woefully inadequate shield against the blizzard's full force. Using the last of his tinder and some damp twigs, he managed to conjure a pathetic, sputtering fire that hissed and smoked more than it burned, casting flickering, distorted shadows. Abigail slid stiffly from her mare, stumbling into the snow, her legs numb. She huddled near the feeble flames, shivering uncontrollably, the damp cold seeming to penetrate her very bones. Vance settled opposite, pulling his warm coat tighter, deliberately turning his back slightly as he gnawed on a piece of jerky he made no move to share. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken hostility, punctuated only by the relentless scream of the wind and the pathetic crackling of the fire. She watched him, every nerve ending screaming danger. His resentment radiated like a malevolent heat, stronger than the dying fire. He was trapped, inconvenienced, and she was the cause. He was making a final calculation, and she knew, with sickening certainty, that her life held no value in his equation. The storm outside was a terrifying force of nature, but the storm brewing in Richard Vance was deliberate, cold, and far more deadly. The last ember winked out, drowned by wind-driven snow. The meager circle of warmth vanished, plunging their inadequate pine shelter into near-total darkness, the howling blizzard the only reality. Abigail's teeth chattered uncontrollably. Numbness crept up her arms and legs. Vance had been still for a long time, a brooding statue across the dead fire pit. Now he moved. He rose stiffly, a dark shape against the swirling white beyond the trees. He kicked snow deliberately onto the last smoking twigs, ensuring total extinguishment. "Richard, what are you doing?" Abigail's voice was a thin, ragged whisper, barely audible. He turned slowly, his face obscured by shadow, but his voice was chillingly clear, stripped of all pretense. "Securing my future, Abigail. This arrangement simply isn't profitable." "Profitable?" She pushed herself upright on trembling arms, swaying. "You mean our marriage? Our life together?" A short, harsh bark of laughter escaped him, instantly snatched away by the wind. "Marriage? Good Lord, were you truly that naive? I require capital, Abigail. Investment. For the store, for land. That inheritance you so helpfully detailed in your letters. It's not a fortune, no, but it's necessary." The brutal truth slammed into her, colder than the wind. He hadn't courted a wife. He'd courted a bankroll. She was collateral damage in his financial desperation. You brought me all the way out here, just for money? Harmony Creek has too many prying eyes, he continued, his voice taking on a disturbingly reasonable tone, as if explaining a simple business decision. Out here, things happen. Storms are treacherous. A woman traveling alone, unfamiliar with the territory, tragically lost. People express sympathy, shake their heads, then move on. It's cleaner this way. He took a deliberate step towards her. It's not much, she pleaded, a desperate, foolish hope that his greed might have limits. Barely covered my passage. It's enough to make a difference, he interrupted coldly. And leaving you equipped would spoil the narrative, wouldn't it? Before she could react, he lunged, snatching the thin wool shawl from her shoulders. She gasped, instinctively crossing her arms over her thin bodice as the raw cold bit instantly at her exposed skin. Can't have you found looking comfortable. He then grabbed her carpet bag, emptied her small store of dried apples and hardtack into his own pockets with callous efficiency. Waste not, he murmured, dropping the empty bag disdainfully at her feet in the snow. Raw terror mingled with a surge of icy fury. You can't just leave me. Not like this. Watch me. He turned decisively, strode towards the shivering horses. He briefly checked Abigail's mare, then moved to his own stronger bay, confirming his choice. He swung himself up, settling deep into the saddle, pulling the thick buffalo coat, the one he'd gallantly offered her hours ago, then reclaimed, tightly around himself. He was a figure of utter self-interest, impervious to the storm and her plight. Richard, please, for God's sake. Her cry was swallowed by the screaming wind. He paused, looking down at her huddled, shivering form, barely visible in the swirling snow. His face was a mask of indifference, utterly devoid of pity or remorse. The storm suits you, Abigail, he repeated, his voice flat, final, cold and soon to be forgotten. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look back. He wrenched the horse's head around and spurred it ruthlessly out from the inadequate shelter of the pines, plunging directly into the heart of the blizzard. His silhouette blurred, then vanished completely into the white chaos, leaving only the howl of the wind and an oppressive, terrifying silence. Abigail stood frozen for a heartbeat, the reality of his absolute betrayal washing over her in a wave of numbing shock. He hadn't just abandoned her. He had methodically stripped her of warmth, food, and hope, leaving her utterly exposed, deliberately sentencing her to death. The fire was gone. Shelter was non-existent. Help was impossible. She sank slowly to her knees in the rapidly deepening snow, the cold instantly seeping through her thin clothes, stealing the breath from her lungs. Despair, vast and crushing as the storm itself, threatened to extinguish the last flickering ember of her will to survive. Alone. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone in the frozen heart of the indifferent plains. The cold was a physical presence, crushing the air from her lungs, slowing her thoughts to a crawl. A dangerous lethargy began to steal over her, a tempting whisper promising release from the biting pain. Just as her eyelids grew impossibly heavy, a distortion in the white curtain caught her eye. A shape, moving where nothing should move. Not Vance. This figure was taller, broader, moving with a silent, purposeful grace that seemed part of the storm itself, not fighting against it. Furs and tanned hides, beaded with ice, blended into the snow-dusted landscape. A long rifle rested easily in one mittened hand. A quiver bristled with arrows over his shoulder. Ice clung to the long, dark hair framing a face etched by wind and sun, stern but not cruel. His dark eyes, intense and observant, missed nothing. A Comanche warrior, the very specter Vance had used to fuel his own fear. Abigail's first instinct was terror, raw, primal fear fueled by settlers' campfire tales. But the brutal honesty of Vance's betrayal, the sheer extremity of her situation, had burned away lesser anxieties. She was too cold, too weak, too utterly stripped of pretense to react with anything but stillness. She watched him approach, his steps nearly soundless on the deep snow, the wind seeming to part around him. He stopped perhaps 10 feet away, his gaze sweeping the desolate scene, her shivering form, clad in hopelessly inadequate clothing, the dead fire pit, the discarded, empty carpet bag, the faint depression where her trunk had briefly rested before Vance cast it aside. Then his gaze tracked the single set of horse tracks leading away, deliberately, selfishly, into the blizzard. His dark eyes lingered there for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, before returning to her. He saw everything. He understood. There was no threat in his posture, only a profound stillness. He saw no weapon, only a lone woman freezing to death, clearly abandoned. After a moment that stretched thin in the howling wind, he moved. Slowly, deliberately, so as not to alarm her further. He came closer. He knelt beside her in the snow, his movements economical and precise. Words seemed superfluous in the face of the storm's roar and the stark reality of her plight. From a pouch at his side, he produced a thick, heavy buffalo robe, rich with the scent of wood smoke, earth, and something wild. Gently, almost impersonally, he unfolded it and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The sudden, profound weight and warmth were shocking, a jolt back towards life. It felt like a physical shield against the blizzard's assault. Next, he offered food, a dense piece of pemmican from another pouch. Her numb fingers fumbled as she took it, but she forced herself to chew the unfamiliar, slightly smoky mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries. Energy, desperately needed, began to seep back into her. The warrior watched her eat, his expression impassive but patient. His attention turned to the dead fire. With an expertise born of necessity, he shielded his hands, struck flint against steel, caught the spark and dry tinder he produced from somewhere within his furs, and breathed life back into the flames. He fed it small, dry twigs, gradually building it into a respectable blaze that pushed back the oppressive cold and danced defiance against the wind. He gestured towards the fire, then to her. "Stay close." Then, astonishingly, he rose and trudged through the deep drift to where Vance had dumped her trunk. He hauled the heavy object back towards the fire, setting it where the radiating heat would slowly thaw it. It was a practical act, yet it felt deeply significant. A restoration of something stolen, an acknowledgement of her worth beyond mere survival. He pointed a mittened hand towards his own chest. "Nokona," he said, his voice low and resonant, carrying clearly despite the wind. He then gestured towards her. "Abigail," she breathed, her voice scratchy and weak, but audible. Nokona gave a single, slow nod. He added more wood to the fire, then settled back on his haunches a respectful distance away, resuming his silent, watchful scan of the surrounding storm. He seemed utterly unperturbed, a figure of calm strength within the chaos. As the warmth slowly penetrated her frozen limbs, thawing her mind as well, Abigail replayed his arrival. He hadn't seemed surprised to find her there, and she noticed again the faint trace of Vance's departing horse tracks, leading away from their pitiful shelter. Nokona's gaze had rested on those tracks for a significant moment before he fully assessed her situation. He hadn't just stumbled upon her. He'd been tracking Vance. He must have seen the man ride away alone, leaving her behind. He knew. The bitter irony struck her with the force of the wind. Betrayed and left for dead by the civilized man who promised comfort and prosperity. Saved by the savage hunter who offered warmth, sustenance, and a silent, profound human decency without demanding anything in return. The blizzard still raged, a white curtain isolating them from the world, but within the small, firelit sanctuary Nokona had created, hope, fragile but tenacious, began to burn anew. The turning point wasn't just survival. It was the stark, undeniable truth revealed in the heart of the storm, where true savagery and true honor resided. For another day and night, the blizzard held the plains captive. But inside the improved shelter Nokona constructed using salvaged branches, her thawed trunk, and the enveloping buffalo robe, Abigail slowly recovered. The fire burned steadily, tended with quiet efficiency. Nokona shared more pemmican and melted snow for drinking water in a small, battered tin pot he carried. Conversation remained minimal, a patchwork of gestures, expressions, and the few words of English Nokona possessed. He pointed to the sky, made sweeping motions with his hands. Storm continues. He pointed to the fire, then to her. Stay warm. Abigail, gaining strength, used gestures to tell her story more fully. She pointed towards the direction Vance had fled, mimed him taking her shawl, her food, pushing the trunk away. She shivered dramatically, pointed at her own inadequate clothing still drying near the fire. Nokona listened with unwavering attention, his dark eyes missing no detail. When she finished, he looked again towards the faint trace of Vance's tracks, now almost buried, and a muscle tightened briefly along his jawline. He understood betrayal. He recognized the predator, regardless of skin color or fine coats. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, conveying not pity, but acknowledgement. Shared understanding hung in the smoky air between them. When the fury finally abated, leaving behind a world sculpted in deep, blindingly white snow under a piercingly blue sky, Nokona prepared to leave the temporary shelter. He indicated Abigail should dress in the warmest layers her trunk contained. While she awkwardly changed behind the makeshift screen of the trunk and robe, Nokona stood impassively outside, scanning the vast, silent landscape, his rifle held loosely at his side. She emerged wearing her thickest wool skirt and bodice, her own worn coat, and sturdy boots. It was still insufficient for the deep cold, but far better than before. Nokona retrieved the buffalo robe, shook the accumulated snow from it, and without a word, draped it back over her shoulders. Its weight was reassuring, its warmth essential. He then pointed towards the distant, hazy smudge on the horizon that marked Harmony Creek. Then he pointed towards the barely visible trail Vance had broken heading in that same direction. His meaning was clear. They were going back. He was going back. And she was coming with him. There was no fear, no hesitation on her part now. A profound trust had been forged in the shared ordeal, unspoken but solid. Nokona set off, breaking trail through the waist-deep drifts with tireless, practiced strides, his knowledge of the terrain innate. He moved with purpose, reading the subtle language of the snow-covered land, the slight depression indicating Vance's passage, the way the wind had sculpted the drifts around obstacles, the faint signs of wildlife stirring after the storm. He wasn't just heading back to town. He was following Vance's trail with unwavering focus. The journey was grueling. The reflected glare of the sun on the snow was blinding, the deep cold pervasive despite the sunlight. But Abigail, wrapped in Nokona's robe, fueled by his pemmican and a burning sense of righteous anger, pushed onward. The weakness and despair of the storm were replaced by steely resolve. Vance would not get away with this. The people of Harmony Creek deserved to know the kind of man who ran their mercantile. As they finally crested the last snow-covered rise overlooking the town, the familiar sight of smoke curling from chimneys greeted them. Down below, life had resumed its rhythm. And there, standing near the entrance to the saloon, gesturing emphatically to a small knot of townsmen, was Richard Vance. He looked remarkably unscathed, holding court, undoubtedly weaving a heroic narrative of his own survival and her tragic loss. Nokona stopped at the crest, his silhouette stark against the bright sky. He looked down at the scene, then turned his gaze to Abigail. No words were spoken, but the question was clear in his eyes. "Are you ready?" She met his gaze directly, felt the solid warmth of the buffalo robe around her, drew strength from the quiet intensity of the man beside her. She took a deep, steadying breath of the frigid air and nodded once. Together, they began the descent, walking directly towards the saloon, towards the man who thought he'd buried his crime beneath the snow. The sound of their boots crunching on the packed snow echoed in the sudden, unnatural quiet as heads below began to turn, drawn by the impossible sight. The reckoning had arrived. The moment Abigail Hayes, draped in a heavy buffalo robe, and Nokona, the silent Comanche warrior, stepped onto the main street. The murmuring knot of men outside the saloon fell utterly silent. Conversation ceased mid-word. Richard Vance, caught in the middle of an expansive gesture illustrating his supposed desperate search, froze as if struck by lightning. His face, moments before animated with feigned grief and heroism, turned a sickly, pasty white. He stared, mouth agape, as if seeing apparitions risen directly from the snowdrifts. Abigail and Nokona walked forward with unhurried, deliberate steps. The snow crunched loudly underfoot in the unnerving stillness. Townsmen instinctively shuffled aside, clearing a path, their expressions a mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning suspicion. Vance stumbled backward, his polished boots finding no purchase in the slushy mud near the saloon doors, nearly falling. "Abigail," he choked out, his voice thin and reedy. "Alive?" "But the blizzard. I looked everywhere. I thought." His carefully constructed narrative crumbled visibly. "You thought wrong, Richard." Abigail's voice cut through the silence, clear, cold, and steady. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough to see the beads of sweat forming on his pale forehead despite the freezing air. Nokona halted beside her, a silent, imposing presence, his dark eyes fixed on Vance, his hand resting lightly, almost casually, near the hilt of the sheathed knife at his belt. "You thought the storm would do your work. You thought I would be forgotten." A low rumble of murmurs went through the onlookers. Men exchanged uneasy glances, remembering the tale Vance had spun just moments before. The contrast between his story and the reality standing before them was stark and undeniable. What madness is this?" Vance sputtered, trying desperately to regain control, puffing out his chest in a weak imitation of authority. "Abigail, thank heavens! You survived. This savage must have found you. Did he harm you? Hold you against your will?" He grasped at the familiar prejudice, trying to deflect, to paint Nokona as the villain. Abigail didn't waver. Her gaze remained locked on Vance's shifting eyes. "This man," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction that resonated through the cold air, "is Nokona, and he saved my life." She let that sink in before continuing, her words measured and damning. "You, Richard, left me to die. You took my coat. You took my food. You threw my trunk away. You abandoned me beside a dead fire in the worst blizzard this town has seen in years." She recounted his actions, his cruel words. "You said the storm suited me. Cold and soon to be forgotten. Those were your words." Vance flinched as if struck. "Lies. Hysteria. The cold has affected her mind. Does this look like hysteria?" Abigail gestured to the warm robe covering her. "Nokona found me freezing. He gave me shelter. He gave me food. He brought me back when you left me for dead." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle on the crowd. "He even recovered my trunk, the one you deemed dead weight." Sheriff Peterson, a burly man whose face was a roadmap of prairie winters, pushed through the crowd, his expression grim. "Vance, you told us a different story. Said you searched till you dropped." "I did. I swear," Vance pleaded, his eyes darting frantically between the sheriff, Abigail, and the impassive face of Nokona. She must be mistaken, confused. "I am not confused," Abigail stated, her voice resonating with cold certainty. "He lured me west under false pretenses, not for marriage, but for the inheritance he believed I carried. When the storm provided an opportunity, he seized it." Nokona shifted his stance slightly, a minimal movement, yet it drew every eye. He remained silent, but his very presence, his calm readiness, underscored Abigail's words more powerfully than any testimony. He was the living proof of Vance's treachery. Seeing his escape routes closing, seeing the judgment hardening in the eyes of the townsfolk, Vance panicked. His carefully constructed world was imploding. With a desperate cry, he shoved past Abigail, not attacking, but trying to bolt, aiming for the narrow alleyway between the saloon and the mercantile freedom. He didn't make it 2 steps. Nokona moved with astonishing speed, a silent blur of fur and leather. He didn't draw a weapon, didn't strike a blow. He simply materialized in Vance's path, an immovable object. Vance slammed into him hard, the impact sending him reeling backward off balance, to land sprawling ignominiously in the icy mud and slush of the street. Before he could even attempt to rise, Sheriff Peterson stepped forward, his hand resting firmly on the butt of his Colt. "All right, Vance," Peterson growled, his voice thick with disgust. "Seems you and me need to have a long talk. Down at the office. Now." Two grim-faced townsmen stepped out of the crowd, hauled Vance roughly to his feet, his fine clothes ruined, his face a mask of terror and utter humiliation. As they dragged him away towards the sheriff's office, a collective sigh seemed to pass through the onlookers. Justice, frontier style, had been served. Abigail watched him go, a deep weariness settling over her, but also a profound sense of release. The storm was truly over. Richard Vance's reputation, as fragile as his finances, shattered completely. In the small, tightly knit community of Harmony Creek, his calculated cruelty and betrayal were unforgivable sins. Sheriff Peterson, piecing together Abigail's testimony with overheard whispers of Vance's debts and increasingly desperate talk before her arrival, needed little convincing. While formal charges in a distant court were unlikely, frontier justice was swift. Vance was held in the town's single cell until a decision was made: banishment. He was escorted to the edge of town with his remaining horse, a few supplies, and a stark warning never to return. His mercantile rapidly failed, its inventory sold off to cover local debts. He rode out not into prosperity, but into ignominy, a man whose greed had cost him everything. Harmony Creek, humbled and perhaps a little ashamed, treated Abigail with newfound respect, mixed with awkward sympathy. Offers of lodging and assistance were made, but the town held too many ghosts, too many reminders of the betrayal. Her journey hadn't ended here. It had been violently rerouted. She needed to move on, to find a place where the future wasn't overshadowed by the immediate past. After purchasing necessary supplies from a newly established competing trader, ensuring none of her money went towards settling Vance's accounts, and acquiring a sturdy mare, Abigail prepared to leave. As she tightened the cinch on her saddle near the livery, she saw him. Nokona stood at the edge of town, near the path leading back towards the foothills, watching silently. She walked towards him, carrying the heavy buffalo robe folded over her arm. It still smelled faintly of wood smoke and the wildness of the plains. She held it out to him, the gesture conveying more than words. "Nokona," she said softly, meeting his gaze, "I can never truly repay you, but please take this back. You need it more than I." He looked down at the offered robe, then met her eyes again. His expression was unreadable, but after a moment, he gently shook his head. With one hand, he lightly pushed the robe back towards her. A gift given in need remained a gift. He then gave a short, formal nod, acknowledgement, farewell, respect. No more words were necessary. Their encounter had been born of violence and extremity, a brief, intense intersection of two vastly different worlds, bound by an unexpected thread of shared humanity. Now their paths diverged once more. Nokona turned, his stride fluid and silent, and melted back into the vast, snow-dusted landscape from which he had emerged. He disappeared towards the wilderness that was his home, leaving as unobtrusively as he had arrived. Abigail secured the buffalo robe behind her saddle. Its weight felt substantial, comforting. She mounted her new mare, took a final, lingering look at the rough buildings of Harmony Creek, a place of shattered dreams and unexpected grace, then turned her horse firmly westward. The sun glinted off the endless expanse of snow. The blizzard hadn't just been survived, it had been transformative. Vance's cruelty hadn't broken her. It had revealed her own strength and the surprising capacity for honor found far from civilization. She rode onward alone into the vast, uncertain promise of the frontier, carrying the warmth of a Comanche hunter's gift and the quiet resilience forged in the heart of the storm. The trail ahead was unknown, But Abigail Hayes faced it clear-eyed, a survivor redefined by fire and ice.